This morning we're going to hear from Mr. Widelitz and get to know him a little bit better. Those of you who haven't had the privilege of being his students, this is our opportunity to get to know him at a deeper level. So let's welcome Mr. Widelitz.
Morning. How's that? Sorry, I promised myself that I would be as relaxed as Mr. Hurtado, but now that I'm up here, I don't think it's going to happen. But I'll give my best shot. Sorry. Aside from Thanksgiving, and possibly the 4th of July, my favorite holiday of the year is Passover, which began last Friday at sunset. I love Passover, despite the requirement that we Jews forego delicious foods like sandwiches and bagels in favor of dry, square wafers that are most closely related in both taste and appearance to cardboard, and despite the yearly ritual of having to survive a family Seder that for some of us is too short, for some of us is too long, and for all of us is a penance by the time the third hour of being trapped in the same room with each other rolls around. Despite these inconveniences and annoyances, I love this holiday because it celebrates something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that's redemption. Who here has seen the Rugrats Passover special? Okay, Prince of Egypt? Okay, so between the two of those, we got half the room covered. So for those of you who don't know the Passover story, here's the TLDR version. The Israelites, the Jewish people, were enslaved in Egypt thousands of years ago. To escape the Egyptian pharaoh's decree that every Jewish male newborn should be killed, Moses' mother put him in a basket and floated him down the Nile, after which he was found by Pharaoh's family and taken in. He grew up as a prince, but later fled Egypt, after which God appeared to him and instructed him to return, confront Pharaoh, and demand the Israelites' freedom. After a series of plagues that God sent upon the Egyptians, culminating with the death of every firstborn Egyptian child, Pharaoh relented and allowed the Israelites to go. However, he quickly experienced a change of heart and led his army in pursuit of his former slaves, who had hightailed it out of Egypt. God, seeing the Israelites having come to a dead end of the Red Sea, parted it so they could cross to safety. And as soon as the Egyptian army followed them down onto the seafloor and the Israelites were safely on the other side, God let the waters rush back in on the Egyptians, annihilating them. End of story, let's go eat. That's basically Judaism in a nutshell. The point of the story is not the Israelites' victory, but the transformation of its characters. The Israelites are delivered from slavery to freedom. Moses evolves from enslaver to liberator. Pharaoh's heart is so moved by the death of his son that he finally agrees to free his slaves. Ostensibly, the central idea behind Passover is redemption through divine intervention. Not only does it commemorate this momentous act of God, but it is also a time when devout Jews look forward to the coming of the Messiah, whom they believe will be the ultimate redeemer of humankind. But Passover is also a time to reflect on the meaning of liberation and all the different things we need to be liberated from. And these examples of divine redemption are only two of the many stories of oppression and liberation in our world. At this season, we Jews are commanded to consider the ancient story personally, as if it had been our own selves who were redeemed from slavery in Egypt. This serves two purposes. It adds personal meaning to the holiday, and it forces us to consider the ways in which we're slaves in our own lives. So today, I want to talk to you about slavery, redemption, many different things, one in particular we can become enslaved to, and the various paths we can take to liberation. Redemption from physical slavery, a horrific institution that still exists worldwide and one whose tragic consequences we're still dealing with in our own society, is a concrete example to which we can look for inspiration. But redemption can mean freedom from other things as well, and there are many, great and small, that enslave us. So what else can redemption look like? In a moment, I'm going to be that chapel speaker that asks you to close your eyes, and I'm going to ask you to think about a case of slavery, either physical or metaphorical, that exists in our world or in your own life. If the horror of physical slavery is something that resonates deeply with you, I will encourage you to sit with it and mentally examine it. You might prefer instead to consider the concept of mental slavery, an idea eloquently described by Marcus Garvey and made famous by Bob Marley in his Redemption song. There are those who, though they may not be physically enslaved, are psychologically oppressed by their would-be enslavers, or even by themselves. But there are still other kinds of oppression that billions of us on this planet struggle with. So many of us can't make it through another day without a drink, or a cigarette, or a fix. They're slaves to addiction. So many of us are unable to be emotionally intimate with anyone, or even, in extreme cases, to function in society because we're terrified of letting anyone see who we are. They're slaves to isolation. So many of us are slaves to eating disorders or mental illness or depression or destructive habits. Others of us are simply unable to refrain from criticizing ourselves for whatever we do. Perhaps we're trapped in the hell of an abusive relationship, or we're the victim of bullying. Perhaps we deal with bigotry and discrimination in our lives. Perhaps we still have dreams about someone we'd rather forget. Perhaps we're slaves to envy or jealousy. I count myself amongst this group that has a hard time seeing someone else's life or accomplishments and keeping ourselves from immediately going to a place of unfavorable self-comparison. So now, finally, I will ask you to close your eyes, take a moment, and ask yourself, what are the stories of oppression and slavery that exist in the world, in our community, in your own life? There is one general story of affliction and liberation, perhaps it's the one you settled on, that I'd particularly like to focus on today. It's the path of redemption from error to forgiveness. Easter, which just passed, is primarily concerned with this subject and illustrates it through its story of the sacrifice of Christ to redeem the sins of humanity. Forgiveness and the redemption of mistakes are powerful subjects to me because each of us, no matter how competent, how compassionate, how thoughtful, make mistakes from which we need redemption. Todd Vanderwerf, a writer for Vox, wrote, "Life is a long process of realizing just how wrong you can be, then dealing with that as gracefully and humanely as possible." While we may try to deal with our mistakes gracefully and humanely, we all have an unfortunate tendency as human beings to become enslaved to them instead. Some mistakes may alter the course of our lives. I've made mistakes that have taken me to places I didn't want to go, that have made me a person I did not want to be. I've made mistakes that have alienated me from people whose love I desperately wanted. I've made mistakes that have destroyed opportunities I otherwise would have had. I've made mistakes that have led me into confusion and those that have simply made me look bad. I've made smaller ones that have cut me or burned me or made me choke, some that have made my week difficult, others that have ruined my day, and still others that have made things all kinds of awkward with somebody. My life has been and is destined to be filled with mistakes of many different shapes and sizes. But this is an experience we all share, and we all suffer to different degrees because of it. However, it's a different experience altogether to become enslaved by the mistakes we make. We have a sad penchant for doing it, but it's something that we do to ourselves. When we make a mistake, we have two choices. We can enchain ourselves to it, dwell on it, allow it to destroy our sense of self-worth, wallow in its consequences, or we can choose the path of redemption, learning from it, using it in its consequences to enrich our lives, and then putting it to rest. This is our choice. If we have enslaved ourselves because of a mistake we've made, our redemption is a matter of the unfortunately difficult task of just letting it go. But the mistakes we make, and our difficulty in dealing them with strength and compassion for ourselves, are one of the reasons that no matter how privileged our society is, and no matter how privileged our place in it is, we are all in need of redemption. We're all in need of redemption from a multitude of different things. So how can we achieve liberation from it? There are a few simple answers to this question, and that's what makes the quest for freedom from the things to which we are enchained one of the hardest fought pursuits in our lives. But we have a beautiful collection of stories of redemption available to us, and I think we do well to contemplate the many different paths they illuminate, because these cases can be inspiring as well as instructive. We sometimes hear stories of people with extraordinary strength who find the wherewithal to bring themselves out of their own oppression. They give us hope that we too can be that strong for ourselves, that we can be the sources of our own redemption. The remarkable example of Frederick Douglass is one such story. After being born into slavery in Maryland, Douglass escaped at the age of 20 and spent the next 27 years working to end the institution. When it finally fell following the Civil War, he spent the rest of his life working to ensure the rights of those who had been freed. His story also tells of the liberation we can achieve with the help of others. Returning just briefly to the Passover story, this is perhaps best exemplified by the actions of Moses, who returned to his former home to face his adoptive father and demand the freedom of his people. Without Moses, the Israelites never would have had an advocate or a leader to inspire them even to hope for their freedom. This was their hopelessness. They had been oppressed so harshly that they didn't even have it in them to imagine what freedom was like. Perhaps you or the people you have in mind today face a similar kind of hopelessness. In these cases, we need somebody to show us the way out of our affliction. And if we are lucky enough to have someone fighting for us, the process may be reciprocal. Those who work for the redemption of others may, secretly or overtly, be fighting for their own. Moses, who, based on the textual evidence, appears had a speech impediment, miraculously found his voice as he embarked upon his spiritual transformation from exiled outlaw to spokesman for his people. In fighting for their redemption, he was granted his own. But whether it comes from within ourselves or through the work of others, redemption from anything, slavery, a mistake, an addiction, an illness, is a path forward, not a way of changing the past. Redemption does not mean that we become like we were never enslaved. Having our chains broken, climbing out of the pit that another person or we ourselves or sheer circumstance have put us in does not mean that these things never existed, nor does it mean forgetting what we experienced. At Passover, we are commanded not to commemorate the enslavement of our ancestors, but to remember our own, to act as though it was us personally who were brought out of Egypt. There are different reasons behind this, but one of them is that oppression and suffering can teach us a number of lessons. One of these is hope, the belief that even in the deepest depths of our suffering, redemption is possible. In the midst of our oppression, we can learn what it means to hope for freedom. This ability to hope is what sustains us when there's no discernible way forward. It's what gives us the strength to make it through another day, another hour, even another minute. Hope is what allows us to keep striving for redemption, even when the possibility of attaining it is uncertain, even when the future is unclear, even when we are overwhelmed by fear that we may never be redeemed. Another lesson our affliction can teach us is faith. Those of you in Faith Through the World's Music know what faith is. Faith is standing on the steps of Hardwick Hall in the middle of a long, cold, desperate winter, staring out at a snow-covered lawn and seeing thick green grass and a magnolia tree in full bloom, like it will be soon. More to the point here, faith is the belief, even in the darkest night of our oppression, that redemption is not only possible, but in store for us. Faith and hope are closely tied up with another precious commodity, and that's perseverance. Nelson Mandela, who would eventually go on to serve as South Africa's first post-apartheid president, was sentenced to life in prison for activities related to his efforts to end this brutal system of segregation in 1963. During his imprisonment, he studied to earn a law degree, he wrote his autobiography, he received a wide array of political visitors, and he corresponded with a number of people who were central to the anti-apartheid movement. With no prospect of ever walking free, he continued fighting for the cause he believed in, enduring until he was freed after 27 years behind bars. His perseverance made it possible for him to make it through every day he was a prisoner. And perseverance is what allows us to push on through our own smaller scale oppression, to envision the sweet day when we will be free of it. Our affliction can also teach us to be compassionate. Many of us have witnessed or been the victims of injustice and oppression in our own lives, and this can motivate us to prevent that oppression being carried out elsewhere. Our suffering teaches us about the suffering of others. Our affliction begets empathy and compassion. And learning this lesson empowers us to fight, not just for ourselves, but also for others. Arguably more important than any of these lessons, though, is courage. It takes courage to find redemption from our oppression. It takes courage to fight, to endure, even simply to hope for that redemption. It took courage for Moses to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. It took courage for Frederick Douglass to board the train that would carry him to freedom. It took courage for Nelson Mandela to continue to work for his liberation and those of his countrymen. And yes, it takes courage for each of us to get up in the morning and to yearn for the day of our redemption against the fear that it may never arrive. We must have the courage to hope and to believe and to yearn and to fight right now. Rabbi Hillel the Elder is famous for his 3 incisive questions. You know them, I bet. If I am not for myself, then who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? The Jewish people have shared his urgency for thousands of years. A number of traditional Jewish prayers ask God to send the Messiah, quote, soon and in our days. And the stories of redemption I've discussed today never would have come to pass without their heroes having the courage to see the immediacy of their need for it. But because they had the courage to fight when and for as long as they did, they gained redemption for themselves and those they were fighting for. Whether we need deliverance from an unjust or painful situation, or we've made a mistake that has affected the course of our lives, or we aren't treated with the respect and dignity we deserve as human beings, or we've done something that we can't forgive ourselves for, or we find ourselves in ever more desperate situations, we need redemption. None of us is free from the need for freedom and forgiveness. And though I can't answer the specific questions of when and how redemption will come to you or those whom you've held in your thoughts today, I can tell you that redemption will come to those who desire it, who seek it, who persist, who endure, who refuse to give up, even when giving up seems like the only thing left to do. It will come to those who believe it will come, to those who cling to hope, to those who are willing to do what it takes to find it, wherever it may lie. In my own quest for redemption, I've often asked myself, haven't I suffered for it? Haven't I yearned for it? Haven't I cried out for it? And haven't these caused me to work for it? The answer to all of these is yes. And though I'm still on my own journey to redemption, I have hope and faith that I will find it, and I'm constantly searching for the courage to keep fighting for it. Of course, there are numerous examples in history of those who never personally realized their own redemption. One of these is Martin Luther King, who was assassinated before he was able to see the racial equality that he dreamt of come to pass. But even though to this day, those he worked for, fought for, and died for have yet to experience the fullness of the redemption he envisioned, his life, work, and legacy have led to a huge amount of progress toward that redemption. 47 years after his death, the dream he had is not only alive, but closer to fulfillment than it was at the moment when others had to pick up the mantle of his fight. And his dream lives on in the hopes and words and actions of others. So my message to you today is this: don't give up. Redemption is out there. As long as you have the breath and the strength to fight, keep fighting, whether it's against oppression from another person, or from yourself, or from the conditions in which you've been placed. Redemption is out there. And my hope during the season is that each of us will find it from whatever it is that oppresses us, soon and in our days. Thank you.